It's so great to be here. Welcome. My name is Barratt-Brown. I'm a senior advisor to NRDC's Canada program. I've got my colleagues here, jet skiing, expert photographer, as well as other things. Every day a different talent, just like Val.
That'll be disproven when you see the recording.
And, look like this. Yeah. You're a rambunctious group of panelists already. I've got Julie Bowe, who's just joined NRDC's Canada program. We're so excited to have her. She spent 20 years working for Ontario Nature. And gosh, I see so many friends and colleagues out there. So I feel like I've been in the trenches with you over the last 4 days. So it's so great. Thank you for coming out on Monday morning. Wonderful.
Yeah, me good.
I think most of you know that NRDC is a US-based environmental organization, but we've had the privilege of working with Indigenous leaders across Canada now for decades, helping to further their vision for their future and for their lands and waters. I've had the personal pleasure of working with powerhouse women like Chief Mandy, Courtois, and Neale. I'm so honored to have them here today, and just want to thank you for just helping me on my journey, which is ongoing. I really want to thank you for being here after what was just an incredible, just bask in the afterglow of the Indigenous Village. I have to say, a round of applause for just an incredible weekend of program, of interaction, of good food, of the smell of smoke, and that incredible chocolate chip popcorn. I'm still working on the pronunciation, but kind of the wind and the light changing during the day, it just felt alive and so different from the concrete of the Palais. So thank you for creating that amazing setting to welcome all of us to Montreal. And I have to mention in that regard, the elder, let's see, what was his name? I've got him written down here. Dave, who's the elder, Mohawk elder?
Kevin Deere.
Oh, Kevin Deere, who opened and closed the ceremony at the Indigenous Village, and he talked about the kind of the dance of life, that snows come and go, that the ripples on the waters move like this, that our heartbeat, we're all connected, our heartbeat goes like this. It was just such a beautiful reminder that we're all connected to the land. I thought it was very powerful, and it was such a wonderful welcome by his, Haudenosaunee Confederacy to bring us together in Montreal, which I understand has been a meeting place for time immemorial, and still feels like a very powerful meeting place. So that was a wonderful welcome for all of us. We heard from so many Indigenous leaders this weekend about how important it is to treat people with justice. That if you treat people with justice, the land and waters will be taken care of. And I think this is a really important theme in the work that all three of you do, in Michael's incredible film that I got to see in its entirety last night, Issue Tissue, the love story. So many powerful Indigenous voices talking about the connection to the land. And I think the power of that spirit of hope at a time where many of us feel, very despondent about the state of the world, after everything that Indigenous peoples in Canada have been through, the incredible impacts of colonization, it's so uplifting and inspiring. So we're going to hear from these leaders today about a part of the work that they do. They do so much work. We're going to talk about Indigenous protected and conserved areas and guardian programs and other Indigenous-led efforts in the conservation space. And also Kim is here to tell us a little bit about what we can maybe perhaps be part of developing in terms of financing these, because that's often a big barrier to their growing as much as they should. So I'm really happy to have this panel gathered. I think most of you know the Boreal Forest is home to hundreds of Indigenous communities. It is home to the iconic caribou that really represents the biodiversity of the forest. It is the largest carbon source terrestrial on the planet, holding twice as much carbon as tropical forests. So it's just enormously important. So we are so heartened by the biodiversity and climate positive solutions that are being put forward by Indigenous leaders. So thank you. And we're so privileged to work with you to help. We really see our job as helping to further your work. So I'll start with Chief Mandy Gull, who I had the pleasure of meeting probably about 6 or 7 years ago in Waswanipi. We came up, long drive. I thought Montreal was far north for someone from Washington, D.C., but I had a 10-hour drive ahead of me to get up to Waswanipi. And Mandy was at the time not just deputy chief, but working very closely with the Broadback Task Force, and we were welcomed beautifully by them to be partners in their effort to protect the Broadback. Mandy has since been elected as the second woman deputy chief to all the Grand Chief to all the Cree, Eeyou Istchee, and is now the first woman Grand Chief. Well, she wouldn't be able to do all her work if it wasn't for some of the members of the audience, and they're sitting there. Chantel, who has been her right and left hand on the protected area strategy. We worked closely with Chantel, she's amazing. Pernilla Talik, who has also been working for some years with the Cree, and is now heading up their climate work. And so we're so thrilled to be getting to work with Pernilla. And Flora, talk about right and left hand. I think she really is your right and left hand. So legal advisor, protocol chief, you've got many titles, but you're amazing. So it takes a village of powerful women, right, Mandy? Anyway, we're just thrilled to have you here and part today. Val Courtois. Well, wow, you really don't need an introduction, but Val is the leader of the Indigenous Leadership Initiative. I probably met Val about 10 years ago, and to see what's happened with her vision, to see this Guardian idea take root, get funded. First, I think it was a $25 million grant from the government, and maybe 30 Guardian programs. We're now, what, you said 120?
And First Nations alone.
And First Nations alone, right. And I think she has a vision, which she's going to talk about today, for growing that much further. But Val is a forester by training. She comes from, oh boy, turn me to go again with the name, Mashtwits? Mashtwits, right, which is a Innu village in what is now known as Quebec. She has many talents. I found out this weekend when I said to her, how could you build this Chapatuan, which is like larger than any Chapatuan has ever been built? She said, oh, you need something built, just call an Indian. And so now I know I can put that on your resume too, right, Val? So thank you so much for being here. And Kim, you're a newer friend of mine, and it's so lovely to get to know you a bit this weekend. And I'm going to have to read your bio because I don't know you as well. But Kim has a very impressive bio. She's an environmental engineer. She's Anishinaabe, Métis heritage from her mother's Peltier family of the Nipissing First Nation. She's currently the project manager, Indigenous Affairs Associate for the Municipal Natural Asset Initiative, and is in the leadership circle and head of the Conservation Finance Working Group for the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership, CRP. She spent most of her career in the finance and insurance industry, gaining several professional designations in climate risk and liability, reporting, energy management, and risk management, as well as designing some of Canada's first financial instruments to advance nature-based climate solutions. So, Kim, wow, thank you for joining us. So as I said, I think the word is out about the power of IPCAs and Guardians and other Indigenous-led initiatives. We've heard a lot about them from leaders this week. And of course, in the Indigenous Village, had lots of descriptions about amazing efforts underway and how they fit into Canada's biodiversity and climate goals. But I thought maybe we could start with you to maybe talk a bit about Eeyou Istchee and how, your protected area strategy, which I guess really is one of the most prominent models of an IPCA in Canada today. If you could talk about how that came about, what Eeyou Istchee means, what the Cree way of life is, just your wonderful description of what it means in your community to have protected an area that is now 23% of Eeyou Istchee, which is just a little short of the size of New York State. Can you imagine that? It's amazing. So she's got aspirations, I think, to protect much more. So maybe 3 times the size of New York, 2 times, 3 times. But anyway, I think it would be great if we could hear a little bit about, that work.
Isto gaz vaziyetno şehuni çalışmaktan Mandy Gull-Masty, Eeyou Istchee. Vaziyetno geldiniz, neşkem tüyüzücüben, hibiga geldiniz, bedoğun hav. Tüzüyen olmak, bu getronde yapçıkman. Good morning, my name is Mandy Gull-Masty. I'm the Grand Chief of the Cree Nation of Eeyou Istchee. I've had the pleasure of knowing Liz, I think it's 8 years now, so we're almost coming on a decade of knowing one another. And Liz has really been, and Liz and NRDC, our friends at NRDC, have really helped us in our project. Our project began, I would say, 15 years ago, that the Cree Nation identified that they wanted to establish a protected areas network. Our territory, Eeyou Istchee, if you're looking on a map, it's in the Nord to Quebec territory. Eeyou Istchee really borders James Bay, Hudson's Bay. To the south are our neighbors, the Algonquin Nation. To the east are Innu friends. To the southeast are Quebec Nation. And then to the north are the Naskapi and the Inuit. So we have a very large territory. For us, it was really a question of mitigating the impact that we've had in our territory. We are one of the nations that was heavily impacted by hydro development. It is from where our modern day treaty emanates. In addition, we have an impact from forestry, from mining activity. There was a vision of developing the north under the term of former Premier Jean Chabet when he announced Barratt-Brown. And the Cree really took this opportunity to establish a Cree conservation strategy. And from this strategy came, the realization that we needed to have our own protected areas network. And for us, Liz says that I wouldn't be able to, I would not be able to at all do this work. I really only had the privilege of being part of the team and telling the story, but this work was really carried out by our staff, Chantal Tetrowater being the lead on this file for many years. And her team, along with, at the time, Flora had been on the team, Pernilla, as well as a number of other people, went to the communities and really engaged our land users, our tallymen, individuals who continue to hunt, fish, and trap and practice Cree way of life, and asked them to share with us information that would be required to really establish a protected areas network that was in line with Eeyou Istchee. And for us, Eeyou Istchee, the Cree way of living, was harmonizing our history as a people, our uses of the land, identifying resources such as areas where wildlife species are, habitat areas, spawning areas, calving areas, areas where we gather medicine, areas where we have stories and legends, all of this information that really reflected who we were as a nation, and incorporated a system of watersheds that was a very scientific process. I think we wouldn't have been able to do this work without our partners who helped us establish, the scientific knowledge needed to identify water sources, watersheds, headwaters in the territory, and really feed it into a computer program that chose various options that were optimized with other information, like the terrain, the quality of the forest, potential impacts that were going to be, affecting those territories that we were selecting, climate, erosion, just a number of criteria, and amalgamating all of this information, and then providing us with a number of options that we could present to the communities. The team went back into the communities, presented the different options, asked for focus groups, asked for chief and councils to really select what their protected area would be. And of course, the challenge of that is really harmonizing each community's selection. So for us, it was important that our conservation areas really had connectivity so that wildlife could continue to, make its way through our conservation areas. That was really important for us. We didn't want to have little islands of conservation throughout Eeyou Istchee. So connectivity was a huge goal for us. And, it's not simple to take 9 communities and all of their different wishes, dreams, and desires, which really were, every single time we want to have 100% conservation. That's probably the hardest work, is to go there and say, that is the goal that we really wish we could meet, but in fact, asking people to choose and select what they wanted to conserve or protect was probably the hardest thing for this team, to go through. And I have to acknowledge that, because, telling people pick what you want to save is probably one of the most challenging questions for Indigenous peoples. We understand the connectivity, the systems of our traditional territories. So it was really hard for me, even as a leader, it was really hard for me. So I'm really pleased that although we're able to achieve 23% of protection for our territory at a really high level, we want to build on that. We have a goal of adding another 30%. We still haven't quite defined what that will be, but we do know that it will be an area set aside. It may have some components of non-industrial development. We're still kind of arguing with Quebec what that will mean. But I think that the work that we've done in partnership with Quebec, Quebec was at the table working with us. Of course, they had their own targets for biodiversity. And I think for me, when we were able to put our proposals down in November of 2019, when we were able to put our proposals on the table with Quebec, one of the things that really struck me was, although we came to the table with different criteria sets, when we were able to bring these selected areas together, they almost matched one another. So to me, that really attests to the validity of traditional knowledge, and the traditional knowledge being as equal in weight to Western science. I think to me that was really what I walked away from that table, is to say our members really know their territory, have a long-standing relationship with their territory, and their knowledge comes from a millennia of knowledge transfer. So I wanted to really put that forward this morning, is that when Indigenous peoples come to the table, they're not just making an ask. They're coming to the table with very heavy, very weighty information that, a scientist or an ecologist or etc. could come in and give an educated guess, but these people have really contributed and obtained and achieved this information over a very long period of time. So I really value that. And for us, working in collaboration with Quebec, working in collaboration with Quebec had its challenges, but I think it also really challenged Quebec to be progressive in what they were doing with Indigenous groups. And, we pushed them very hard. We really made them, open up their views on what conservation could be, what protection could be. I hope that they learned a lot from our Tallyman and what what we were prioritizing. And I just really hope that Quebec realizes, when you work with Indigenous peoples, you're really setting yourself up for success. You're gaining that social acceptability, but you're really doing the work of not only protecting and conserving the territory, you're helping an Indigenous nation really, put themselves forward, giving them the space to speak about their culture, to speak about their identity, and you're making that critical link to that involvement of Indigenous peoples being at the table, voicing and directing what their needs are. And to me, I think at the end of the day, those projects are probably the ones that are the best received by the members and will succeed longer in the long run. And I think for the next steps, my expectations are really high of Quebec. They've come here, they've showcased a number of things. I think if you can work this closely with my nation, it is something that's replicable with the 11 nations here in Quebec, and I hope that more will be put on the table, because they keep talking about reaching these targets, and really they have to be very open, and they have to be very just really challenging themselves to look beyond the scope of their usual go-to. For us, in the future, I really envision our protected areas to be parks. I would love to see Eeyou parks be the future of our nation, where we have our landskeepers. We are part of the Guardians network. We tailored it a little bit to our needs, but we are part of this network. But I want to see park rangers teaching about Cree culture and having tourists come and learn about Cree way of life and learning about who we are in our relationship with the territory. I think that that has to be, a portion of the employment and future that we create for youth. So I know that, for me, this COP, I've had very high expectations. I'm curious to see what will come of the negotiations. But I'm so thankful that Val made this space and the Old Port with the Indigenous village. I think it just really had this spirit of collectivity and connectedness, and I was very grateful to be there and to see some of the other nations and leaders that I've had the opportunity to meet this year and really showcase what we are doing as Indigenous peoples. I think that was really a great initiative from Ireland. So thank you for that, Val. We very much appreciate that. So I will pass it on to Val. I'm sure that she can add on to the work that she's done with the Cree Nation. It really has been indispensable for us, and I look forward to hearing what she's been doing with the other nations here in Canada. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you, Mandy. You're always so inspiring. I could listen to you every day. And I sort of have this last few days, which has been so wonderful. Anyway, I do want to follow up on what you just said. We have Miles Richardson here, who is an incredible leader in the space from the Haida Gwaii, and I've known of Miles. I don't know that we actually met until this weekend for many decades, and so I just want to recognize that you're here. Thank you, Miles, for coming. Miles is also an integral part of ILI, and you can see he's wearing his beautiful beaded necklace, what do you call it, on a male? Medallion, thank you. And that identified him this weekend as one of the leaders of ILI in the Indigenous village, so it's great you're still wearing it, Miles, and I'm sure Val will want to make sure you're wearing it for a long time to come. But anyway, so I also see Emily here in the audience, who was one of the Guardians that spoke last night at Michael's film screening, and I just wanted to quote a little bit from her from last night, because I just thought she was so powerful when she said that Guardians are the reverse of residential schools. And she said, they are elders in training. They are the hope and the future. And I just thought that was so beautiful. You're so articulate, Emily, and that was just really great. It just kind of got me in my heart. And I think, Val, you must really love that when you hear that from your young people, and you're surrounded by so many of them now. So I just thought I'll leave it to you to tell the audience a little bit about what the Guardians are, how the concept came about, and also about this new network that's been launched this week. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Liz, and I'm really thrilled that you're here too, Amberly. I wanted you to see and meet one of the great Cree women leaders, because I see a really bright future for you. And I think we need to lift each other up as women, as leaders in this space, because I have a lot of hope. I've done so many interviews that about hope, and it's not easy in this time. I mean, you go outside and this concrete jungle and climate change and political movements and conservatism and right-wing conspiracies and all of this stuff that is bombarded at us. But what gives me hope is seeing people like Amberly in this room and others, and that's why we do this work. It's for Amberly's, and it's for David's, and it's for all of these folks. When I first came into contact with Guardians is when I moved to Labrador, and I went to Labrador to become the chief forester for the Eeyou Nation, but also eventually become the director of culture and environment. And they had Guardian programs in place since 1992. In fact, they were one of the early adopters. They were inspired by the Haida Watchman program. We happened to have a guy named Larry Innes in our office who had spent time on Haida Gwaii. In fact, he had a Haida Bucks coffee cup. I'll never forget. You guys had a coffee shop that was making fun of the Starbucks Emporium empire. And so, and we were very, very inspired. And I saw how it transformed the lives of individuals. I remember this young man, who I won't name just for his privacy, but the first time I met him, I had to rescue him because he had jumped off the bridge attempting suicide and was getting taken out to the ocean. And we had to go canoe and recover him. And he was one of the few at the time. This was 2002. And in the 10 years previous, there had only been 12 students who had graduated from high school from those two communities, Chagit and Matagit. And he was one of the few who had graduated from high school. And I thought, you know, what's going on? Why is this young man so desperate for losing his life? Like, why is he making such an effort? And he says, I have nothing to do. I don't have a place here. I finished high school, and so I didn't have as much time to go on the land, and so, there's this like disconnect in the generations. And I said, let's see what we could do. I need some help in the forest office. Do you think you could start working there? And about 2 years later, that young man became completely sober. And started really working, reconnected with his own family, and his grandmother who had raised them, and now he's a dad. He's got 5 foster kids. He's the deputy fire chief of the community. People look to him, and he's healthy and strong and proud. And I thought, if that could happen to him in Shed, imagine what it could do for other youth across the country. And there's nothing that makes my heart sing more now when I hear mothers say, I hope my kids want to be guardians when I grow up. And the little kids who look up to the guardians and say, I kind of want to do that when I grow up. And to be quite honest, Liz, there's a little bit of selfishness in this too, because when I was growing up, if I had had the option of being a guardian, I totally would have been a guardian. It's the coolest job ever. And it's why I went into forestry, because I didn't have that option. That was kind of my way of training up to be able to kind of have this sense of guardianship. And so that's the motivation that is behind the work that we do, and why we push so hard. Because I really do think that as we're emerging from a genocide here in what is now known as Canada, that we need to have that hope. And that hope comes from healing in the land. And so I just wanted to tell that story because that is absolutely my personal motivation. I mean, I'm a conservationist at heart, but I'm a humanist fundamentally, and that's what this is all about. And about in 2014, what was then Tides Canada, now Makeway, then the Nature Conservancy, now Nature United, and us, we got together, and because we were all working in different regions where there were guardians, we thought, what would happen if we brought guardians together? And it was the very first meeting in Squamish where we had guardians come. There was about 30 programs. There was only about 20 in the room. We couldn't get everybody to make the trip, but 30 programs, including that young man who had jumped off the bridge and who had transformed his life. And we asked them, we said, what do you need for your programs to keep going and growing? And what do you think would be necessary for other programs to grow? And they gave us three directions. They said, one, funding is a real problem because most of the programs were cobbled together. And I know this because when I directed the Innovation program, we had 18 guardians. We were the largest guardian program at the time. And we had a budget of $1.5 million in the early 2000s. And I spent 80% of my time either filling out applications or reporting on those applications. And I kept thinking, like, there's no way that I can really think about the future of my program and really design it because I'm too busy trying to make the internet work so that the government can get the report that they need so that I can get the check next and make sure that these guys got paid and, this kind of cycle. So I was like, yeah, this is true. We need some kind of way to make sure that this vision is funded. The second was networking. All the guardians, they knew there were other people out there doing work like this, but they had never met. And often, we're in remote, isolated places. It's not easy for people to come together and meet. So they said, we want a network. We want to be able to learn from each other and connect and have a sense that we're part of something larger. And then the third thing that they wanted was that they wanted a profession established. As a forester, I'm wearing my ring. And I don't have to argue with anybody about my professionalism. That's a recognized profession. When I come and give an opinion or or submit a plan and I sign it with my registered professional forester designation, there is trust in the professionalism of that. But for Guardians, there was not really a lot of trust. And each individual nation at every time had to explain what Guardians do, why they're important, and then there was always pushback. Well, do they really have training? Like this kind of thing, right? We are consistently fighting against systemic racism in this country. And that's part of it. Is the lack of recognition about the contributions that we make to these things as Indigenous peoples. And so as the only Indigenous-led organization that had made and organized that meeting, we took it really seriously when they asked for our help on those three measures. And we've been working on all three ever since. And so we started with the funding. I thought, well, first, let's make it so that Guardians can do what they're good at, which is being Guardians. And I don't know if anybody's applied to Environment Canada programs and the computer system. You know they haven't redesigned that since 1998. I'm not kidding. And if you're in remote places where you've got dial-up or satellite internet, or it used to take me a week to fill out one form because I'd have to restart it. And I was like, no, let's do that. And Miles and I and Stephen Cadfrey and Owen Mercury and Dave Porter, we pounded the pavement, as we said, and we had over 180 lobby meetings. And at the time, we had proposed $500 million. We thought, if we want this to be a national program, we've got to hit at least the third of the First Nations. And that's going to cost a good $500 million. It costs each program for that core capacity about $1 million to run. That's the minimum that is needed for a community program to really be anchored. So we thought, let's make the pitch. And interestingly enough, every single party was like, yeah, we can get behind this. The Conservatives saw the bootstraps aspect of the Guardian programs, and this was about jobs, so they were excited about that. And the Liberals were like, "Oh, reconciliation, this is going to be perfect," and the Greens were like, "Environment, good." So we got, and the Bloc Québécois was a little funny about it, but we didn't spend as much time with them. God love them. As they say in Labrador, God love them. So we had real support. In fact, we never heard a negative thing except from the officials in the department in terms of their reaction. And I'll tell you a little story about that, some of those negative reactions that we got. But generally speaking, from politicians, we got a good answer. However, the government and the department were like, well, we're really nervous about this. Usually this is what we do. So as they say in Labrador, they dipped their toe with the $25 million investment. It was 1/16 of what we asked for. I remember I was telling Miles, because Miles, you were angry on that budget day. And I thought, no, let's see where we can take this, because I think this is a seed we can grow.
That was just because of McKenna's promise she went back on.
Well, we went to McKenna's office on that budget day. And you remember the two promises she made to us? One is that this was a seed and the funding would grow. And two, that this would be designed in a nation-to-nation way. And we said, okay.
That's a principle.
And okay, if you've agreed to this, then we will build a network and your money is going to go through the network, because it's not good to have a program run out of Gatineau. With all due respect to the beautiful officials who have the best intentions, but from Gatineau, how can you know what's right for Waswanipi or Shehaji or Chapleau, right? You're so far and you can't know these things. So that was the condition, and that was behind what was in the network. So we've made advancements. The network was announced and launched this week at the village. I mean, the minister likes to say, we had to give it to the minister, because we had to make this announcement at the pavilion that he had funded the network, and he said he launched it, but that's not right. The network launched itself at the Indigenous village, let's be clear. And it's a big deal. I think it's a big moment. And now today, all of the funds that come from Environment Canada will go through the network and go under Indigenous decision-making. And you know what? Canada doesn't have a vote on the network. They are an ex officio member. Their role is simply to share their expertise to the network, but the decision-making is entirely Indigenous. And its next challenge is going to be to establish the profession. We want to have a national curriculum framework. We know there are commonalities between guardian programs. All guardians should have a sense of their relationship from their nation's perspective with their environment. All guardians should have a sense of what their Indigenous laws are related to that relationship with their environment. All guardians have to have a sense of how they are representative of their nationhood and their responsibility. All guardians should either know their language or be learning it or be participating to revitalizing it, depending on the conditions where you are. There are commonalities between programs. But what works for Waswanipi isn't necessarily what works for Shihaji and what works for Haida Gwaii. So we have to create flexibility in the system that recognizes that kind of ground up approach, right? And so, Miles, you could learn all you want from Caribou, but that's not going to be very helpful in you expressing your nationhood. This work of regaining our nationhood, regaining our authority, is really one of those other moments where we need to come together. So that is some work that is to be done, Liz, in this movement. But a little bit of history. And let me tell you quickly that story of the official, because I just want to tell you how far we've come and some of the things that we hear as we're advocating for this. So, Indian and Northern Affairs at the time, the two deputy ministers who I won't name, I'm sure you know who they are, some of you in this room. I sat down with them and I'm telling them about this program, $500 million, and how it changed lives and what it does for the land. And the one deputy minister who was on the Crown Relations side of it, so he was in charge of all land claims in Canada, said, "Oh my God, you're being so unreasonable. That's too much money. Why don't you start with $1 million?" And then he made an awkward joke. He said, "Why don't we call it the Samuel de Champlain Memorial Fund?" I kid you not. And for anybody who knows, Samuel de Champlain landed on Innu lands first. This was him picking. And do you guys remember that show, Ally McBeal? Yeah. I was in my head. I was strangling the guy in my head. Like I was leaping. I had to physically sit on my hands not to leap across the table. But that's how far we've come in 5 years. And so I hope that the Guardians are really creating the conditions where we can start to attack the systemic racism in this country, attack the colonial history, and really build a new model, one that recognizes that Indigenous nations are fundamental to the federation that is Canada. And I think it's going to give us the conditions to redesign this country and actually achieve prosperity and leadership and honest to God authenticity in who we are as a people. And I hope that's an example for the rest of the world.
Well, you've done it again. You're amazing. Thank you so much. I mean, it's just such an inspirational program in so many ways. I think about the work I did 25 years ago out on the BC coast when I had a guy sitting in front of me, actually all of the Nuu-chah-nulth that were part of a new decision-making body that had been created. And Nelson Keela, as Miles will well remember, Nelson Keela sitting there when somebody from the BC government said, "Oh, but we are protecting culturally modified trees," which you call CMTs, because we've told the loggers just to cut halfway down the tree so that the modified part remains in the middle of a clear cut, right? And Nelson kept his composure. I couldn't believe it. I thought, oh my God, and this is modern day, right? And I know you deal with this all the time. You're amazing. You have endurance, resilience, strength. Unbelievable. And so, yeah, it gives me hope too. And strength myself for the work that we all have to do ahead of us. So, well, thank you. And Kim.
I know I was putting you in tough spot there. I know. But no,
You have a really important story to tell. We'd love to hear about this Conservation through Reconciliation partnership, the work that you are leading on creating, I think, a report that's coming out soon on financial mechanisms that will be Indigenous-led with Indigenous principles. I think this is super important because otherwise we're just going to make the same mistake again. Mandy and I were together at Climate Week in New York. We went to a biodiversity forum, rural biodiversity forum. I think 8 guys, all white, mostly my age or older, sitting on our stools and talking about financing for biodiversity. Never mentioning the 80% biodiversity that is under in traditional territories of Indigenous peoples. Never mentioning that maybe some of that funding should go to those communities to help support the work that they're doing. That is critical if we're going to meet our goals. So we came back from that, Mandy and I, and said, we got to dust some things up here, right? And so we're starting to think about ways we can work together to develop, bring the best minds together around financial mechanisms. It's not an area I'm particularly well versed in, but I'm always worth getting in there and learning, and if I can help. But that's why I really wanted Kim to join us, because I think she's got some ideas to help kickstart this discussion, and so really, really pleased to have you part of this panel. Did I give you enough space between Val and you?
Yeah, that was good, thank you. Thank you so much. Annie, bonjour, hello. So my name is Kim Neale. My last name is from my father, who was adopted. I don't really know his background, but my mother comes from an Anishinaabe and Métis background from the Nipissing First Nation. I am a first-generation university graduate in my family. I studied environmental engineering because there was no Land Guardians program. And so I was like, what am I going to even do with my life? But, I'll just do engineering, which took me a really, really, really long time to do. And I was there for a long time. But one of the reasons why I was at university for so long is because I became so interested in the intersection of environmental engineering and finance and policy, and it really just clicked for me one day. I had founded the Gull Students for Environmental Change at the university, and the university at the time was really struggling with this multi-million-dollar deferred maintenance issue. They were going to lay off a ton of people, and we were like, well, if you retrofitted the entire campus, you wouldn't have an energy bill like you have right now, and you wouldn't have to fire all of these people. You wouldn't have to lay off these people. So what we did was we convinced all the students that energy efficiency was important. And all of the students on the University of Guelph campus now give $1.50 a semester to Canada's first energy retrofit fund, and they have used that money to now leverage $54 million of energy retrofits all over the entire campus. So that was my first foray, if you will, into the world of alternative finance. It came from a deep love for the environment and for people. And so when I went out into the world, I did get recruited onto Bay Street, where I was for a very long time, usually the only woman in the room, usually the only engineer in the room, and definitely the only Indigenous person in the room. And really was working with companies all across Canada, working on them understanding what environmental liability is, what their exposures are to cumulative environmental impacts, and trying to put a dollar value on it for them so that they, A, would buy my insurance policies, but B, really start beginning to think about the things that they need to be changing that aren't insurable. And then, one thing led to another, and I kind of left the corporate sector, and was welcomed into a community on Manitoulin Island. And for those of you who don't know Manitoulin Island, or who do missing the Great Spirit Island, it's the largest freshwater island in the world. It sort of sits in the middle of Lake Huron and Georgian Bay, and Lake Superior flows in, and I look out onto the North Shore. It's surrounded by 7 First Nation communities. It's one of the only places in Canada where there is 50% Indigenous population, and they really welcomed me into the community. And I was doing some climate change plans for a number of communities, and look, I was like, okay, well, I guess we could do energy retrofitting, and we could do a bunch of stuff, but like nature is Manitoulin. So that's how I found the Municipal Natural Asset Initiative, which is a really weird and long name for a not-for-profit, and it's because we started with municipalities doing nature inventories. And so finally getting nature on a financial balance sheet and looking at the ecological services, the value of nature beyond carbon. And so now we work across all of Canada with First Nation communities and municipal communities that very separately to do nature inventories and are sort of on the cutting edge and pioneering a community-based approach to nature valuation that looks at all of the ecological services and particularly in the First Nation communities, finally biocultural indicators are emerging in some of our valuations. And it's that space where we think that innovation can occur. So I'm not really talking about money right now, I'm talking about valuations, but the reason why it's so important in all of the work that we're doing with the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership is because Indigenous nations in this country probably have the richest data sets. The Land Guardians program is responsible for the most beautiful, richest data sets. I can tell you right now, after working with 100 municipalities across the country who have 10 times more staff than Indigenous nations have better data. They're already leading the way in Western science for data. They have better data than watersheds, who are significantly funded by every single province and are the broken policy model for enabling capital finance to flow to nature and to communities. So some of the work that we're also doing is now we are just finishing a report with the Treaty 1 First Nations in the Winnipeg Metropolitan Region. So this is the first time ever that through their collaborative leadership initiative, they've said, we care about nature. We know that nature doesn't understand colonial boundaries. And so we want to do a natural inventory of the entire watershed and ecosystem. And we want to integrate Indigenous knowledge finally into these valuations. And so that this report will sort of be the underpinning of what could become watershed financing, ecosystem level financing. Why does that matter? I think, the one impact bond that we have seen in Canada is from Deshkan GB, which is in Southern Ontario. It's a collaboration between the Chippewas, First Nations, and the surrounding municipalities there. It's slightly a watershed, like it's a very small area to start with. But because it's like a collaborative agreement on how natures can be valued, they were able to then go to the private sector and sort of say like, oh, because of this really strong governance, because of this collaboration, we can structure some kind of community impact bond. So what an impact bond and why I love it so much is because instead of carbon, where you're selling to usually a polluter or what we call an outcome buyer, you got to be selective of who you sell your carbon to. In community impact bond structures, you actually look to community like stakeholders all around you who benefit from the ecological services. So everybody in a community, for instance, benefits from clean drinking water. So we all have a vested interest in that drinking water. So it's really possible to go to industry and say, oh, will you fund our watershed level ecosystem services management work? And then when you start pooling all of those funds together, well, guess what? Then the banks come. Then the insurance companies come. They all want a piece of this impact bond because they're all looking to decarbonize their portfolios and invest in people and in nature. And so we are looking at, what evolved out of all of this was like, I found the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership, which is this amazing research collaboration. And it's sort of run under the University of Guelph, but it has Indigenous leadership. And those Indigenous leaders came from the We Will Rise Together and ICE reports, like, to enable IPCAs. And there's 7 research streams, and it's been operating since 2019. And the last research stream, the 7th research stream, is IPCA, Infrastructure, Economics, and Finance, which is a bit of a mouthful. And so, like, the group there, you know, we were sort of thinking, oh, we know that this person over here is doing carbon, that this nation over here is, like, has a land trust. Like, you know, we started looking at all of the IPCAs, which now there's over 100. And we know that all of the data is there. And so now we're getting together and really just trying to drill down, like, okay, how much private sector, how much public sector, how many hectares, how many people, Indigenous people are, and we really want it to be this user-friendly finance database to then share this knowledge with all of our other Indigenous nations to sort of say, like, oh, here's the financial pathways that folks are taking, and what else is needed. Because we know right now that we have to increase investment into nature by 26 times to even be even close to meeting. And that's not going to be, like, I love how maybe the Canadian government announced the $800 million for projects, but when you put it into context, like, we did one restoration project that was $54 million. It was only 150 acres. So, you know, when we think about all of the Indigenous nations that are not on beautiful, pristine lands where we will need to be doing restoration, like, there's not enough public sector funds to overcome this. And we want to unlock $100 billion from the capital sector going directly to Indigenous nations. And we know that we can only do it together. So, you know, after looking at the data, we really have put together what, thanks to Val, actually, and the model of the Land Guardians network, and this idea that we can network and grow together. We put together what we're calling the Restore, Assert, and Defend network, which is completely focused on Indigenous-led conservation finance, and trying to, like, really drive the 7th stream of the CRP forward to see how much private sector capital we can unleash, you know, very quickly. Like, if you can do it in 5 years, like, maybe we'll learn from you. Yeah, and that, because we need to accelerate this as fast as possible, and we need to, you know, use all of the data that's coming out of the Land Guardians program, and this idea that we are all, like, every time a new IPCA comes out and there's new data available, it just increases our argument to, yes, the government, but also the private sector, like, that this is the way forward. There are more Indigenous nations prioritizing nature-based solutions than other governments in Canada. And the data is there. We just need to elevate it as much as possible. So, yeah, it's like a little bit of what we're doing on finance. Lots to go.
Well, it's exciting, it really is. And I was at a panel, I think, on Friday, where Smart Prosperity was talking about the fact that Canada has invested $5.3 billion in climate, but they had $17 billion worth of damage in BC from climate, from the terrible fires and flooding that happened last year. just last year alone. So, there's a huge shortfall, and I think this whole idea of having the private sector support ecosystem services, invest in that, because otherwise we don't have a planet, they can't do their work, they can't do their businesses, it all makes sense. But it's a big leap, it's a big leap, and we have to, I think, break out of that colonial model of just government handing out money, right? Because you have something to offer the world, and you should be paid for it, So anyway, I'll stop my proselytizing here, but it's great to hear that, there's good thinking going on in the space, Indigenous-led with Indigenous principles, because I think that's, the key to success going forward. But here we are, we're at the COP. I want to throw out a couple of questions, and then I want to turn it over to the audience to ask some questions. But, what are you taking out of the first week? We've got another week to go. It's exhausting. We can take that one thing out of it. But, we have had some announcements from Canada. It's not enough. I'd love to hear more about your vision for really what Canada needs to do, what the world needs to do, but what Canada needs to do. I heard Minister Gull-Masty talk at length about how First Nations will lead their strategy to meet biodiversity goals, but are they delivering what they need to deliver? And so what messages are you taking to leadership now? So any one of you can answer that question. Jump in.
Well, we might have written some of that speech for him. To his credit, though. I remember the moment the Prime Minister used the word guardians for the first time. It was in the House. It was in Parliament in 2018. And we had arranged to have another member of Parliament ask a question, another Liberal member. And we had written the Prime Minister's response, which included the word guardian. And it's been a real effort to have Canada start to recognize that they can't do it all. As much as they say it's their responsibility to do, they're just not doing it. Labrador is an area of 300,000 square kilometers in size, the size of Texas. And there's one Environment Canada officer who works to take care of that landscape, and his office is in Goose Bay, and guess what? He got no travel budget, so he relies on the average citizen of Labrador to call him about problems in order to fulfill the responsibilities of Canada around things like spills and species at risk and all of these things. And Labrador is a giant landscape that is very sparsely populated. Only the coast is populated, and Goose Bay and Labrador City because of development. And so it's not easy to catch problems. The last year that I was director of the Environment Office in Labrador, in 2009, it was the year after the financial crash of 2008, there was 1,000 active mining exploration camps that I had to review the permits for in that summer alone. And so, as much as the Crown government say that it's their jurisdiction and they're taking responsibility for that, 80% of the Canadian population lives within 200 miles of the American border. They just don't have the capacity of fulfilling that responsibility. And so it's been really good to say to the Prime Minister, well, if you say, the first thing he kind of stated when he became Prime Minister, he said, the most important relationship to me personally and to the future of the country is the relationship with Indigenous peoples in Canada. And we said, great, let us help define for you what that means. And to his credit, he's been listening, and he has said it in New York, he said it in Europe, he said it in trade agreements, and that's been good. But like I said, we're still emerging from systemic racism, and frankly, in my personal opinion, in my humble opinion, the goal of reconciliation is a challenge, not because we don't have political will, but because the ship of government takes that long to tack.
Yeah.
And so, I think it's been really great that the governments have recognized it. I had a good conversation with Minister Guilbeault, or Stephen, he hates being called minister, if you meet him. Stephen, and when he came down to the village, and we've been interacting quite a bit. And he said, look, when we accepted to host COP, one of the conditions that we told China was that it would feature strongly Indigenous peoples. And then I kind of chuckled and said, well, you did a terrible job in the COP. Like, other than supporting what we're doing, you could actually do better by that goal. If we had tried to get 3 days of Indigenous-led programming in the COP, we never could have done it. There never would have been that space in that concrete glass building that's all full of colors from the 1970s. That never would have happened. And so we've got to kind of always keep their feet to the fire and always challenge what they mean. And I'll be damned if I'll be used as a token for intentions. Like, we don't have any time to waste. Like, we're in a dual crisis. We've got children, there's more children in care today than there ever was in residential schools. Many of them are taking out of our communities. We're losing the potential of these folks. Our elders are passing away. Our libraries are passing away. We don't have time to have people with good intentions out there. As important as that is, we gotta kind of like really show what that action is. And as nations and in our nation, as we're rebuilding our nationhood, we have to express them. We have a duty to our future generations and to our responsibility with our lands to express that vision and to build our power as people. And so that's what I'm expecting out of COP. Look, no matter what happens in the negotiations, I hope that they keep the recognition of rights and titles in the targets, because that's how countries measure progress, and I do want to see that. I hope it doesn't get to the preamble, because nobody tracks following a preamble. I really want it in the targets. We don't know what will happen. We have an observer status. We don't have a vote in what that looks like. We've been working with different state governments. Some are more allies than others, and the IIFB, they have all my admiration for the work that they're doing. But what brings me comfort, Liz, is not necessarily what's being negotiated in those walls. It's what's actually happening on the ground. And if Canada is going to achieve that target, if we are going to kind of, really ensure that these landscapes can sustain not only us as peoples, but our economies and our futures, then it's that work that's really going to matter. And there are trillions of dollars that have been extracted from our landscapes. I'm probably underestimating the value of what has been, someone should actually count that. I would love to see an economist do the work of all of everything that's been extracted from Indigenous lands since the creation of Canada, versus what we're asking for to take care of it now. Mm-hmm. We're not asking for that much. So, yeah.
You're here. Mandy, any comment on that?
Ditto on Val, I think she said it all. I also have high expectations for what the negotiations are going to, create. Of course, I want to see that representation of Indigenous peoples in tracking what they're going to do. I think that's really important, that there has to be an independent Indigenous body that really gives their opinion on, the work that has been done and has it been successful. And like Val said, we are really doing corrective work. We're the people that are in the front lines. For me, it is way better to empower the peoples that live in those regions, that have knowledge, that understand the environment, that understand the intricate systems of that environment, than funding outside groups to come in and kind of give you this very scientific, detached, theory of what could happen. So for me, I really appreciate what Canada has announced, but we also have to continue pushing them to really be accountable to the things that they've announced. For me, that's a big thing. We've had some success with our partners in Quebec and Canada, but there have also been, some gaps in some of the things that they've promised. So we're going to continue pushing, and I think that as a country, as a country that is a very green space that really protects one of the largest assets, which is the boreal forest, on a global scale, we have to do more. We have to do more. I personally feel like the targets that are set are already, beneath what is really needed. And our governments have the challenge of choosing between, economic development and protecting the environment. And we have to be realistic. We are at a place now in our time as human beings that the value of the environment is far outweighing economic development. We have to be realistic. Where people 20 years into the future will look at us and be like, what the hell were they thinking? How could people just allow that to happen? So we all have the duty and obligation through our voices, through our votes, through our participation, through our activism, to really put that pressure on Canada, because they are part of a global system that's going to determine where we're going. And I think that, for me, that's one of the big things, that Canada has so many potential solutions, knowledge carriers, people that can contribute very significantly to the issues that we're facing as a country. And if they don't take advantage of that, we are all going to lose out. So I hope that Canada can really become a model. That's what I want to see. My expectations are so high for the COP. I really want to see Indigenous peoples front and center, because it's of nobody's benefit if you, don't use the tools that we are offering and providing as Indigenous peoples.
All right, so Kim, I will come back to you, but I just want to make the comment, you are the models. Forget Canada, right? So that's why NRDC decided 2 decades ago to focus on our work with Indigenous leaders, because I personally was working on climate and biodiversity treaties, and I had a great life. I traveled to Geneva, to Bonn. I was in that little scrum of NGOs that followed delegates around for that comma here and, whatever, promise there, and targets and timetables, and, it's important work. But so much was missing for me of what was really happening on the ground, because we don't have time. Right? And I love, Val always talks about guardians as moccasins and mudlarks. Do I have that right? On the ground. And Mandy told people in New York that at the Climate Week. We met with some huge companies. You're going to have to remind me what that Chinese one was. My kids would know, but I don't. What was it?
Huawei?
What's that?
Was it Huawei?
No, it's not Huawei. It was a clothing company, and it's Shein. I don't know, Shein, right? Everybody's like, you don't know Shein? And I'm like, oh God, okay. I do know Target. They were there. Ralph Lauren. Okay. So people don't know this, but Viscose comes from the boreal forest, and so we had this large group assembled by Canopy, and Mandy said, you know what? Yes, okay, so your big talk right now is asking your suppliers under scope 3, what are you doing? Are you, that's also not only carbon, but with FPIC, do you have an FPIC policy? And how do you know your suppliers are telling you the truth? She said, we're here, we're on the ground, we're in these places. Absolutely, most Canadians live, within 100 miles of the border. I've been so privileged to be up. And Michael just finished an incredible 42-day trip across the Boreal. And it's full of incredible Indigenous leaders and guardians now who are the eyes and ears of what's happening on the land. So it is incredibly valuable. You are the models. And I think my next and last question will be, what can we do to support you in this? Because we need to bring this message to the world. We saw Michael's film last night. We are literally flushing the Boreal down the toilet. Procter & Gamble is the largest buyer of pulp in Canada from the boreal forest. 1/3 half of Charmin, Bounty and Puffs is coming from the boreal. These are forests that are rich with Indigenous communities, with wildlife, with waterways, with the carbon, everything that we need for our future, and we're flushing it away. And I don't think most people know that. The movie starts with people feeling toilet paper on both sides of their cheeks, and one's Charmin and the other one's 100% recycled. They're like, kind of feels the same to me. And would you buy you want the soft one that, the bears like? Or do you want the recycle? Everybody they interview recycled. So, so people want to do the right thing, they just don't know. So what can we do? What can others outside of Canada do to support the incredible work that you're doing?
I was going to say, like, start actually following through on UNDRIP. It's not included, like, it's totally separate from these cups. It's like this whole other silo, you know, and like we can talk about FPIC, like pull it into all of everything.
Here, did everybody hear that? UNDRIP? Does everybody know what UNDRIP is? Okay.
So I think that's like number one.
Yeah, but you have to, for the people, we had some nodding heads, explain what UNDRIP is.
So the United Nations Declaration for Indigenous Peoples' Rights and the rights of Indigenous peoples, sorry, UNDRIP. And so it was very much developed like in the United Nations structure, and it's not getting picked up. Or, you know, maybe a company might say, oh, we acknowledge UNDRIP, but they don't actually do UNDRIP in their day-to-day work. And that's something that we talk about all the time in the RAD network, is one of the biggest barriers to unleashing capital finance directly to Indigenous peoples is, the private sector doesn't really implement UNDRIP in their day-to-day work. And so that's something that we really want to continuously center whenever we think about, like, okay, what does an Indigenous-led conservation finance or an economy look like? It's one that sort of is pushing companies, provinces, nation states, all of them to actually implement UNDRIP. And one of the ways I think you can do that here, and one of the things I would really love to see is we've talked a lot about like loss and damages and like future loss and damages that Indigenous peoples and the most vulnerable people in the world will inevitably have to absorb most of it. But what about the cumulative damages that have already occurred? And I really believe that, like, internationally, we need a fund that is very separate from loss and damages, that really focuses on cumulative impacts, cumulative environmental impacts, and the fact that mostly Indigenous people and the most vulnerable peoples in the world, peasant farmers in particular, as well, are the ones who are dealing with these cumulative impacts and they don't have livelihood anymore because they're downstream in the Athabasca and are seeing the worst impacts from the oil sands. And oil sands companies are just picking up and walking away. And there's not strong enough legislation in our country to force cleanup and force any action on cumulative impacts. And so that's why I was really inspired too yesterday with Courtois and David Flood and them, having the courage in their nations coming together and having the courage to push the government and the Canadian government and the provincial government on cumulative impacts. But I still think we need a fund. And it needs to be Indigenous-led, and it needs to be led and distributed to people of the world who are the most impacted by the impacts that we've already, not the loss and damages that we are expecting to see from climate change, but the ones that we already need to recover from a millennia of damage and ecocide. So those are the things I would like to push under cumulative impacts.
Yeah. Well, and Mandy, it was your friend and colleague, Romeo Saganash, who tried to get that bill through before he retired as MP, and it didn't make it through to implement UNDRIP in Canada. Mm-hmm. So hopefully that will come back. But Val, this is something that you've been talking about for a while, is the role the Guardians can also play in restoration. And I wonder if you want to comment about that, because there is, what a mess out there, right? And we heard from so many incredible leaders of the Indigenous village about their campaigns where there are mining tailings, where there's huge legacy of football fields of clear cuts, where there's oil and gas extraction that has left a mess like the tar sands, and their communities are all living around all these areas. And it is. I think Kim's raising a very good point about liability and cumulative impacts. Maybe this litigation will go somewhere with this and generate some attention. I hope so. But this is another potential, as you said, you're cleaning up. I hate to say this, it's a nightmare, but it's also healing, right? Part of healing the land.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's an incredible act of reconciliation for the country to say, Guardians, you know better how to restore these areas than anybody else. We know as a forester, there's nothing that drives me more crazy than others in my professional or the industry saying, well, forestry and caribou could get together. I have never once seen the evidence of that. We have never ever seen a caribou reoccupy a disturbed landscape. They avoid it like the plague. And I don't blame them. And so I think there needs to be, you can't engineer everything. I mean, I'm an engineer as well. I'm a forest engineer. So there's a saying in Quebec that engineers are eating owls. Like, it's just, you can't always design nature. And so restoration is important, but the reality is we're not going to be able to fix everything and restore everything in the way that we can. But in places where we can, we should be relying on the knowledge that we have and contributing to that. Caribou knowledge and science, like the entirety of caribou in Canada is managed based on science that is about 40 years old. The first radio collars that were installed in caribou were in Labrador because of low-level flying and the military activities in Labrador. And the basic premise for caribou management is based on their movement. And so they use the caribou collars to see when they congregate, when they come, when they calve, but there's so much more to caribou than how they move. And a caribou's population cycle is 70 to 90 years long. So Western science doesn't even have the full picture. We have survived with a tick for 10,000 years. So clearly, we have something to offer to the world about how to behave and treat and love caribou. But I'm gonna just, since I have the mic, take advantage and actually answer your question. There's a couple things that I see. One is when you have power and influence, and that is a privilege, then A, you have to check it, and B, you have to use that privilege to create space and uplift others. And I think that's really, really important. The ILI is in a process of now leading one of the most successful environmental campaigns that you've never heard of, the International Boreal Conservation Campaign. That'll be the first in the world, and credits to my fellow members in making that space and recognizing that there's only so much you can do by saying, I support you. There's a lot you could do by saying, let me make the space for you. And so I really hope that the environmental movement and the philanthropic movement start to do that. It's not just by saying that we are here on Canadian Haga traditional territory and okay, check mark done, let's do what we always do. There's a lot more to be done, and I think that kind of moving out of the way, but also using your privilege when you have it. Any one of us who has privilege as leadership, we have a duty to give back to our family, and we do that. Ethel, my friend Ethel, who I love, if she goes to any meeting, those little craft tables where there's always lovely crafting, and she'll buy the whole table up because she wants to support that movement, right? Because she knows that it's important that those artists have a living and that they're showing culture, and she's reinvesting using her privilege in our community. We all do that when we have privilege in our community. It's part of our natural laws as Indigenous peoples to do that, to uplift others. So that's one. Two, don't be afraid to show love. So much in our societies now, we don't talk about love. And I'll just remember Elder Dave Crochet Jr. as he was working with the ILI, he constantly talked about love. And I so respected him for that because I grew up, my father's an RCMP officer. He was a bit of a stick in the arse. I mean, that's part of what you do when you become a police officer and a survivor of residential school, and showing love is a hard thing. He did as good, and now he's a big softie, like he shows love all the time. But when I was younger, that was harder for him. And I understand, this kind of like this weird toxic masculinity that's in the world, and this like TikTok thing where you're just showing snippets of your experiences and you're not actually creating deep connections. And so I think love is a part of that solution. And so yeah, those are the two things that really, when you ask that question, that's what came to heart. So thank you.
All right, well, we started a little bit late. Can people stay for maybe another 15 minutes for some audience questions? And if you can't stay, just, make your way out. But I think if we can extend this a little bit and have the audience come forward, if you've got some questions, that would be great. And by the way, thank you, Val, for that. Really, thank you for that. It's beautiful. Should we bring a microphone out, or we've got? Oh, right. Where is it? Oh, it's standing one. All right. I didn't see that there. Yeah, I don't know if people really caught what Val just said, but an environmental campaign, IPCC, just turned into ILI. Like, they just turned over all their assets to Val. Okay, and ILI became independent of them. They are now a registered organization, finally, right? And they got all those resources and some terrific people, I think, too, to help you out. So that's a really incredible story and needs to happen more often, obviously. Okay, please.
Hi, my name is Peter Wood. I'm with Canopy, and I'm really glad I was able to come here. I wish the entire COP could have seen this presentation because there's so much important information here. And I just wanted to say to Val, I'm also a forester by training, maybe on the conservation side of things, but I have a huge appreciation for the role you've played. I've also been involved in FSC for a very long time. And I know that systems like FSC and other things that we're constantly pointing to are only as good as the information that is contributed to that. And there's always these consultation processes and requests for input. But ultimately, we know that this is only as good as the eyes and ears on the ground and the way that feeds into it. So for Canopy, when we look to point towards good sources of fiber and away from controversial sources of fiber, I'm wondering in this Guardians program how that could potentially be feeding into that system. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I think we could probably design an entire session on answering that question. I'm going to do my best. Look, FSC has been a wonderful attempt to think about looking at how to do things well. But I was an auditor for FSC before I went on the board, and I audited principles 3, 6, and 9 under the previous standard. Role of Indigenous peoples, the ecology or the ecosystem-based approach, and then high-value conservation forests. And I got to tell you, as an auditor, I was pretty hard on the companies that I was auditing. In fact, in Quebec, I systematically, no matter what, gave them a corrective action request that was a major car when it came to Principle 3, because in Quebec, the rules upon which that the government manages forests means that Indigenous peoples actually cannot influence landscape values. So they do something called harmonization measures. So you can protect your cabin, and you might be able to think about the bridge and how they cross the river, but you have no way of ensuring that moose is sustainable in your territory in the way that they engage with you. You have no way of ensuring that caribou continues to thrive. You have, and for an Indigenous nation, that means that you have no assurance that you're going to continue to be able to be who you are in those landscapes. And to me, those standards need to be done in a way that ensures that. Now, I got pushback from the FSC system when I made those statements as an auditor, because they said, well, we have to have some FSC certificates in Quebec or else the system will break down. right? And I'm like, what am I doing here then? Like, how can I support this? And it was the reason I went on the board. I'm like, well, maybe if I sit on a board, then I could start to change the system. But there's a problem with the design of it. Now, it's the best certification system out there. It's the best of bad options. And you know, our campaign funded the creation of the Boreal standard early on, the International Boreal Conservation Campaign. And so there's lots of work to be done. But I think we can do it. I mean, our friend David Flood at Wakatomin, he's been working on intact cultural landscapes, and there's been calls for those things. And there is a need for deep surveillance and actually checking to see if assumptions that are being made, especially on principles 6 and 9, in how we value these forests, are actually coming to fruition. And the system doesn't really ask for that right now. And I know that that's exactly what David is working on in the intact cultural landscape. And the last comment I'll make about FSC is two of my environmental colleagues. And sometimes best of intentions with this, but it doesn't always work out in the way that you put it out. So for example, the intact forest landscapes designation. Good intentions, I'm with you. We should be protecting intact forests, yes. But if you're in an area like Tessina or Eeyou Istchee, where we are as peoples also needing to think about our future economic models, we need to have the space for creativity to do that. And sometimes the absolutism of the environmental movement does not allow for that. And I can guarantee you, like Mandy just talked about, that overlap between the cultural values and the ecosystem values. If we do well by Indigenous management, we're going to do well by ecosystem management. And so I really hope that the FSC system and kind of the whole system around these kind of models of management evolve enough so that we can truly influence them in the right way and have the impact on the ground that I think is intended by them. So yeah, thank you for your question. I don't know, Mandy, if you have any thoughts, because you've lived with FSC in your territory.
For myself, I really have a vision of having like an Indigenous independent body that's a monitoring system in place that kind of gives that golden seal of you have attained or worked towards the principles within FSC. I think it has to be an independent, separate body, and it has to be driven by Indigenous peoples who are going into the field, doing the monitoring, giving feedback, going to those individuals that are impacted by forestry in their traditional territories and giving a very honest statement, and I think sometimes that's probably the hardest thing because like Val said in her critiques, it wasn't always heard. And I think that these systems, although well-intentioned, they have to really reflect. They have to evaluate. It's been a number of years it's in place now. Are we really achieving what was, the spirit and intent when these types of mechanisms were created? And right now, I think that there is ample opportunity to really incorporate an independent Indigenous body that can give that monitoring. You have to be bold enough. If you really want to do what you say that you intend to do, well, you have to be able to put yourself in a position where you are open, to having that proper feedback. And for me, although I do respect the intention of it, I don't think that it is really serving Indigenous peoples the way that it should. So I'm a bit of a critique. I think more needs to be done.
Great, thank you. Julie?
This is working. First, I want to thank all three of you for speaking today. I'm so inspired, and I've been here this is my 5th day, just full of ideas and excitement and inspiration, and I'm rushing off to Thunder Bay, back to Thunder Bay after this, but again, I need some time to reflect on all of this. But one of my early observations just after the last few days is a lot of the presentations that I saw at the Indigenous Village were about the Boreal, or the Northern Forest. Here, have a look at this. and just how much value there is there in terms of carbon storehouse, biggest wetlands in the world, these species that exist like caribou that exist almost nowhere else. I mean, the list could go on. This area is so critical, it's so important. And when I was thinking about Kim's comment about the community and who is the community who benefits from this, it started to dawn on me that the community that benefits from the stewardship and conservation and protection of the Boreal is the world.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about some of the financial mechanisms, I totally appreciate, we're starting with the rights and responsibilities of Indigenous nations and the work they're doing. And then we're moving out to the Canadian government, which is, the Canadian people to help support this work and understanding there's a massive shortfall there. But as Liz pointed out, this shortfall is so enormous. We need to go to the world to ask for support for this work, because these are the lungs of the planet. Like, this is where the carbon is. So I just wanted to kind of put it out there. Have you had any success yet talking to other nations and talking to intergovernmental organizations like the UN and others about how to support this work, the climate and biodiversity intersection, and whether you have or not, and also where you see the next steps are, and possibly, as an NGO and others, like how we may also encourage that kind of thinking, that kind of level of financial support.
As if you don't have enough to do here in Canada. Yeah. Well,
I maybe we can say, first of all, thank you, Julie, and also thank you for being one of, in NRDC, for being one of those NGOs that is sitting on the Indigenous-led conservation finance group. Like, there are a number of NGOs who have come forward to say, like, what can we do? And my thoughts always is like hectares and dollars is what you can do. And then also to begin to take those risks on those cumulative impact lawsuits that we need to follow, because a lot of First Nations can't do that. And so I think that there is already some of that happening here. But I do think that the private sector has a huge role to play in like stepping forward as well, and sort of saying like the Boreal forest is for the world and should be Indigenous-led conservation all within the Boreal forest. And I think if all of us were to put pressure on the private sector to sort of say like, hey, what are you doing? It would bring those other like political actors along. Because I keep hearing like over and over, like, oh, the province is stopping an IPCA, or, our IPCA is in line and all these other ones got it before us, and it's the federal government, there's that. And I'm like, no. Like, if you were to, create them, like, I do think all of the IPCAs are the highest quality conservation products. If I were like a financial person, and so I think we can trigger them before waiting for politicians.
Well,
so that's
and
my
we
thought.
heard, because we heard from the Indigenous village that many communities are just saying, this is our IPCA, right?
Yeah.
We don't need to be approved by a province or a Canadian government.
Yeah.
This is our IPCA, so I think you're absolutely right about that. So, last word, maybe address that question, whatever you want to do, because we're going to have to bring this to a close, but yeah.
I just want to say, look, in Glasgow, they announced the $1.7 billion fund to support Indigenous-led conservation around the world, and that was just a drop in the bucket compared to the other financial announcements that were made around those meetings. And what we found is that a lot of those funds are being spent not necessarily directly to the Indigenous peoples that are doing the work, but in some way to the weird apparatus that has been built around the environmental movement and Indigenous peoples, and that is an inefficiency in the use of those investments. And so I think not only do we have to have more money, but the way that it gets to the communities really matters. And we've shown it in this country. The value on investment of Indigenous-led conservation is almost immeasurable. I mean, we've tried to measure it, and we've got numbers, and that helps. But but that those investments, as much as possible, need to come to us, and we're trustworthy because our own survival depends on it. And so that's just the last thing I'll say about that. And I did notice though, Liz, Miles was interested in he raised his hand. I don't know, Miles, if you were.
I just said Miles. Yes. So if everybody's fine with carrying on, because I don't want to keep
I'll be
people
quick.
past it. Oh, you'll be quick, okay.
Thank you, Val. Should I turn this into a question? You know, it's a statement.
Go on.
As you build, as we go forward, and it's a really exciting time, Indigenous people do have a chance to be a good influence and even to lead the way on leading humankind out of this self-induced crisis we find ourselves in. So building relationships at the government level, which the Guardians Network is a great example of. Building creative financing options is a really important thing, but there's another piece that we really need to understand, and you're asking the question of what can NGOs and others do to support achieving those big possibilities. One is built on the truth that the ILI or Guardians programs are an expression of nationhood. Really importantly, each nation who holds title to their territory and authorizes a Guardians program is ancient and autonomous, sovereign, if you will, if you want to take that language as Indigenous people refer to it. And there's really important work to do in that area. And all I'm doing is appealing, be aware at your National Resources Defense Council, all the good supporters over the years are one of the reasons we're here. Just keep this in mind. And we had a really graphic illustration of what needs to be done at the Indigenous House over the last few days. Many of you, and I'm going to compare what happened yesterday to Mandy Gull and her nation. Yesterday, a Boreal chief from BC stood up, a traditional hereditary chief, appealing to the supporters to recognize what he saw as the traditional, the real title holders amongst his people, because he reminded us, all you're recognizing and dealing with is the band councils. And those are a colonial construct, he said. And you're continuing to destroy my people by doing that, he said. And he appealed to you not to continue doing that, to create space for their nationhood, if you will, as one of the speakers said. And then you look at the Grand Council of the Cree of Quebec, Grand Chief Mandy Gull. There's no question who speaks for the Grand Council of the Crees. They have a modern written constitution. They're hunters, they're trappers, they're village leaders, all respect the process their modern nation has put in place so that they can come before all of you and speak with one united voice. Every nation in this country is between those two extremes. The ones who, I don't blame the village, the village council, the band council leaders are Quagios, they are Haida, they are Innu, but only they can resolve those issues. So the rest of us need to support them in resolving those issues, because functional governance within our nations is an unstoppable, it is the truth, is an unstoppable force. I just wanted to leave here with that in mind. It's an important part of the next steps. I think we're going to solve these crises as humanity. I think that's an important part of it. That's an important step along the way.
I think I'll turn turn it over to Mandy for the last word then, because Miles, wow, hit the nail on the head on the Crees and their own constitution. They created their own government. They're sovereign. It's a powerful model.
Thank you for that, Miles. It has really been, a major tool for the Cree Nation that we stand united. We do have our challenges internally. We don't bring that in the public space. We keep it amongst ourselves, but we speak with one voice, and I think that has really allowed for us to continuously build. And it is something that, I look across this country and I continue to learn as well the different, types of governance that each nation has. And I hope, to be a supporter in a good way to those nations who are looking to remove themselves from a colonial construct, which is something that was placed on us through our modern treaty, the band council system, that is a colonial construct. But speaking with one voice and having one leadership, that is the core of Cree culture. So it is something that I'm very appreciative that our nation has benefited from. In terms of, the last question that Liz asked and what we're doing here as part of these discussions, we have to remember that at the end of the day, independently, as individuals, we all have our own sphere of influence. It can be through your vote, it can be through pressuring Parliament, it can be through making documentaries, it can be through speaking and advocating for, environmental issues, supporting Indigenous nations, putting your dollars into funds that will really drive the solutions that are being carried out at the local level. And it can be through you as an individual person. If you look around your environment and ask yourself, what can I do to create that change? It is through you. We can no longer be passive. We can no longer just, wait for negotiations to solve the issue or for people to be, doing work on the field. We have to actively engage at the individual level every day, driving less, biking more, knowing where our money goes, where we're purchasing. Purchasing power is probably one of the biggest keys that's so underrated. And I really encourage you as a citizen to look for that traceability, to look for the sourcing of, everything that you purchase. I've learned so much through Canopy about the impact of viscose on the environment, and it's really made me think twice. And it has had a major personal impact on me and the way my family consumes. So I think that's something that we all have to remember, is the decisions that we make in our daily activities have a significant impact on the planet, and sharing that story with people and encouraging, people that don't want to change or don't care, encouraging them in a good way, that contributes as well. I believe that we are all solution holders. We can't just wait for these big things, but we have to make even those tiny little changes. They contribute incremental changes to, let's hope what we see as a global solution for the future. We're in a time where we cannot wait anymore. We have to act.
Thank you so much. And I think it will give us hope in taking action. I think a number of people said that this week at the Indigenous Village, that acting, right, is a great palliative to what's going on. So I have 3 incredible active contributors to this planet, and I'm so honored again to have had this hour and a half with you and to be able to work with you. So thank you. Give the big round of applause, and thank you so much for coming today.